Family Guy is a lot like fast food for me. I know it's bad, and I usually wind up hating myself for eating it, but goddamn if it doesn't just hit the spot sometimes. Family Guy was one of the first adult animated shows I ever saw. I remember seeing a promo when I was super young that featured this clip.
Oh, look at that handsome man.
You son of a bitch!
And that was it. I was sold. This show was going to be my favorite thing for all of middle school and a good chunk of high school. I remember lying in bed horribly sick watching Family Guy on my iPod Touch after secretly signing into my parents' Netflix account. I felt like complete garbage, but at least I could giggle at this show that I knew I wasn't supposed to be watching. It really was the forbidden fruit in my house. The apple of Eden, if you will. Wait, hold on a second.
Ryan, look out!
Oh my God! Brian just got hit by a car. Brian the dog. He's gonna be okay though, right? That's just the cold open kind of. He's gonna be okay, right?
Yes, Chris. I'm afraid that our Brian is dead.
Holy crap, Lois. Family Guy just killed off Brian the dog. And yes, I did actually think that Brian the dog was dead for good. I did a frantic Google search right after this. Horribly sick in bed. That's how it played out. Let's talk about it. Family Guy deciding to kill off Brian is easily one of the strangest decisions I've ever seen in an adult animated show, and honestly, in any show ever. Brian is an integral part of the family dynamic within Family Guy, and he was a part of the majority of my favorite episodes of Family Guy as well. When Brian and Stewie set off on an adventure together, chances are it's going to be a pretty great episode of Family Guy. So I have to ask, how and why did this happen? The how is pretty easy to explain. Brian and Stewie are playing street hockey outside after getting a brand new street hockey goal, and it seems innocent enough. But then, out of nowhere, a car comes roaring down the street and Brian doesn't see it. Stewie went inside for a quick moment, and when he comes back, he realizes something terrible is about to happen. And then, bam. Brian gets gruesomely hit by a car driven by an unknown person that is never revealed to the audience. The Griffin family rushes Brian to the vet, but there's nothing that can be done. They share a final moment together, and then he's gone.
You've given me a wonderful life. I love you all.
Wow, that was pretty depressing, and honestly, it's an incredibly brutal way to kill off a beloved cartoon dog. I did not remember Brian's death being this gruesome when I originally watched this episode so many years ago, and in revisiting it, I think it's a bit overdone. I get that they wanted it to be shocking and dramatic, but this just feels way over the top for a show that tends to use violence for the sake of shock comedy. In the episode after this, Into Harmony's Way, there's an incredibly graphic joke about Peter committing suicide after leaving his life as a celebrity musician behind. So, in juxtaposition with Brian's death, I'm left feeling kind of confused at what the writer's intentions were behind both of these graphic moments. Family Guy being overly graphic and violent for the sake of comedy isn't all that rare, but for Family Guy to be graphic and violent for the sake of drama is a fairly new occurrence at this time in Family Guy's run, with the only other episode that comes to mind where something similar to this happens being Screams of Silence, The Story of Brenda Q, an episode about Quagmire's sister being in an abusive relationship. I don't know if it's just me reading into things too much or being too die-hard of a Family Guy fan, but this whole thing just comes off as kind of tasteless, and really anytime Family Guy is graphic and violent for the sake of drama, it just feels wrong, because the show tends to use graphic violence in a completely different way more regularly, so it just leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Another thing that caught my ear during this revisit was Lois's weird delivery and line after Brian dies. I had always heard people quoting the scene as, "That's right, Chris, our dog Brian Griffin is dead," but what Lois actually says is this.
Yes, Chris. I'm afraid that our Brian is dead.
I don't know how this misquote came to be, but I can see why people were mistaken. This line and the delivery is just so stilted and awkward that it comes off as comical. So maybe the misquote started out as a joke about the weird delivery, but regardless of where the misquote came from, it is a really weird line that stands out for all the wrong reasons. But that brings us to another question. Why would the team behind Family Guy decide to do something this brutal and drastic? Seth MacFarlane, the show's creator, gave a pretty direct reason as to why. He said, "It reminded people this is still a show where anything can happen despite the fact it's been on for a while." And this reasoning seems pretty sound, and it's honestly a bold choice that I could absolutely respect if things played out differently. But before we get to how this decision played out and why it didn't work out so good, we have to talk about the fan reaction. In short, fans were super pissed off. In the same interview from the previous quote, Seth MacFarlane also said, "We were all very surprised in a good way that people still cared enough about that character to be that angry. We thought it would create a little bit of a stir, but the rage wasn't something we counted on." Fans were angry, sad, and utterly baffled by the decision to kill off such a beloved character. And while there are some funny examples to point out, like a couple of fans getting tattoos in remembrance of Brian Griffin, a cartoon dog, most of the backlash behind this decision was fairly understandable. The two highest rated episodes of Family Guy on IMDb are both stories centered around Brian and Stewie's comedy dynamic. And the Road to series of episodes are some of the highest rated and most beloved episodes in the entire series. Killing off Brian was, essentially, a way of killing off the most entertaining dynamic Family Guy had going for it. But as I'm sure you're all aware, Brian is still a character in Family Guy today. So now, we have to look at the aftermath of this decision. Now, if you had to guess, how long do you think it took for the show to go back on its decision to kill off Brian? Would it be a whole season? 10 episodes? Well, get this. Brian the dog was dead for 1 full episode. Technically, you could say Brian was dead for 3 episodes if you want to count the episode where he died and the episode where he was resurrected, but since that falls too close to Jesus Christ and I don't want to give Seth MacFarlane that much credit, in reality, he was only out of the equation for 1 episode, and that episode was the aforementioned Into Harmony's Way, an episode centered around Peter and Quagmire starting a band together. Into Harmony's Way is an episode that wouldn't have featured Brian prominently anyways, so it makes his absence way less impactful than it should have been. And part of the reason Brian's absence from the series was less impactful than it probably should have been was because Brian was replaced in the same episode he was killed off in by Vinny. Vinny was voiced by the late Tony Sirico, known for his roles in The Sopranos and Goodfellas, and he was essentially Italian Brian the dog. He was an Italian stereotype, give or take. We only got to see him for a few episodes, so it's hard to really get a gauge of his actual character, and I might be in the minority of all this, but I really liked this change. Vinny quickly slid into the family and assumed the role of Stewie's new best friend, and I can see a world where this relationship developed into something that was just about as good as it was before with Brian. The problem is, Vinny was never given enough time to develop into anything more than a quick replacement for Brian, and that's what makes this decision to kill Brian off so terrible. If the team behind Family Guy wanted to replace Brian with Vinny, they could have stuck with it, and I think fans would have eventually warmed up to the character. But since Vinny came and went so fast, the audience never really got a chance to know his character, and on top of that, the audience never really got to see what Family Guy would have been like without Brian. There really needed to be a Road to equivalent episode that featured Stewie and Vinny going on a similar adventure to what Brian and Stewie used to go on, so that the audience could decide whether or not this dynamic could work. But it's clear that the real reason the team behind Family Guy did this was because they wanted to shock audiences into tuning back into the show. Seth MacFarlane may have tried to play it off as a smart decision that was made to make people appreciate Brian the cartoon dog, but if that were the case, they should have kept Brian dead for way longer than just one full episode. Brian dies in one episode, is gone for one, and comes back in a third. That's like Marvel fans saying the MCU takes risks because they killed off half the cast of the characters in Infinity War just to bring them back in Endgame. Yes, I am comparing the death of Brian the cartoon dog to the MCU, but it is the exact same kind of fake risk that formulaic entertainment constantly falls into. The creators behind these formulaic properties will try to say it was a bold choice that changed things forever, but in reality, it's just a quick dose of shock value to get people interested again. It's easy to see why this episode where Brian dies is the second lowest rated episode of Family Guy on IMDb, because at the end of the day, the whole thing was just pointless. The only good thing that came out of this decision to kill Brian and Family Guy was a few really funny tattoos from die-hard fans of the character. And if you want to talk about taking an actual risk, that's about as risky as it gets. And that's about all there is to say about the arc where Brian the dog was killed in Family Guy. And honestly, after revisiting it, I feel pretty underwhelmed. While this series of episodes wound up being pointless, I think it does say something about formulaic content on the whole. This was a fork in the road for the people behind Family Guy. They had to choose between making a bold, drastic change or leaving things the way they were. And just like many other creators behind formulaic content, they tried to have their cake and eat it too. Just like in the episode where Marge leaves Homer in The Simpsons that I talked about a few weeks back, or the comparison with Infinity War to Endgame, there is no playing both sides when it comes to changing something's formula. You either have to change things or not change things. Sure, the writers and Seth MacFarlane himself will try and say that they did make a change, but they're just lying to themselves and the fans so they don't have to face the larger issue with formulaic shows and movies. The reality is, formulas get old. And unless you actually change things up in a satisfying and entertaining way, you're gonna get stuck going downhill into mediocrity. Thank you all very much for watching this video and making it this far. I do really appreciate the support, and if you liked this video, make sure to like and subscribe and all that fun stuff. I'm officially moved into my new place, everything's going good, so we are back on track with content, and I'm gonna keep on rolling with it past here. No spoilers for the next video, because honestly, I'm not sure what it's going to be yet, so I couldn't even spoil it if I want to, but stay tuned. I'm sure it'll be a great time. I'm having a good time looking back at some of these older shows, checking out new ones, talking about things going on in the industry when it comes to adult animation. There's so much going on right now. There's so much to talk about, and I hope that you will tune in for what comes next. Once again, thanks for watching, like and subscribe, all that fun stuff, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.